Good evening. I'm Abdikheir, Vice President Research and International at the University of Manitoba, and welcome to today's cafe. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ozi Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with the indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. These cafes are initiated by my office a few years ago to bring the researchers from the university to the public in a comfortable setting. And we felt that the bookstore, in a corner of the bookstore with some coffee and snacks, is probably the very comfortable place to bring the researchers together with the community. Today we have an exciting and very relevant topic of discussion: is Canada a safe haven? This will involve a discussion around the knowledge of our expert panel and moderator on experience in resettling refugees in Canada. I'm sure our audience will contribute to this conversation tonight as well in a respectful dialogue of shared experiences. I would like to introduce your moderator for this evening, who will tell you more about the panelists and also some ground rules that will guide the discussion this evening. Carol Sanders has been reporting on newcomers to Canada, making international headlines, which has earned her national recognition, but most importantly, her reporting has shared the local stories of the growing diversity of people calling Manitoba home. A Winnipeg Free Press reporter since 2000, she has carved out a niche in Winnipeg media, getting to know immigrants and refugees and the people helping them resettle and how the system works or doesn't. In 2014, she was a finalist for the Canadian Association of Journalists Human Rights Reporting Award for her coverage of the usually closed-door immigration and refugee board process. In 2015, she won the Amnesty International Canada's Media Award for her coverage of the world's largest refugee camp and the people there waiting to come to Winnipeg. She has broken the news to the world about the perilous journeys of asylum seekers, from the Somali man who nearly drowned in the Red River trying to swim into Canada in 2015, to the Ghanaians who nearly froze to death walking over the border on Christmas Eve in 2016. As a journal assignment reporter, she has covered health issues, court cases, the fullest and occasional city council meeting, a sports story, and is happiest when she is learning about someone or something new. Please join me in welcoming Carol Sanders as your moderator this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Jayas. Welcome. I'm going to be your moderator, and I'm just going to do a little overview of how we're going to proceed from here. Each of our panelists is going to speak for 5 minutes or so about their perspective on their topic of discussion. And after all the panelists have spoken, I'm going to open up the floor for discussions or questions, and I'm going to be passing the mic around so everyone can hear your comments and questions. The evening's panel presentations are being video recorded, just so you know, for later uploading on the Café Scientifique website. A link to the video will be posted on the umanitoba.ca/Café Scientifique website next week. The last question is going to be taken around 8:25 p.m. and that's when things are going to wrap up afterwards. There's refreshments on the side table and some additional materials you may be interested in, so please help yourself throughout the evening. You will notice that there are evaluation forms on your chairs and that we ask you to fill out these forms and leave them on the materials table at the end of the evening. I'd like to remind everyone before we get started that this is a discussion forum, and we ask that everyone participate openly and in a respectful manner. So tonight's presenters are Dr. Shauna Labman, Ahmed, and Lori Wilkinson. Dr. Shauna Labman is an assistant professor in in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. She writes and speaks extensively on refugee issues, and her published work covers questions of human rights, discrimination, refugee protection, gender, resettlement, and private refugee sponsorship. She's testified before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Immigration, and you may have seen her in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights video exhibit, Seeking Safety. Her book, Crossing Law's Border, is expected out next fall and shows how legal language can legitimize or delegitimize the protection routes refugees pursue. Abdikheir Ahmed is the director of Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. He has previously served as the executive director of the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba, that's IRCOM, and Abdi has extensive experience working with immigrants and refugee communities in Winnipeg's inner city. Laurie Wilkinson is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. She's also the editor of the Journal of International Migration and Integration and director of Immigration Research West. Her research focuses on studies of racism, settlement, and integration among refugees and immigrants. Her current work examines the resettlement experiences of refugees, the health and well-being of refugee children and their families, and the experiences of Indigenous students in post-secondary education. So now I'd like to start with you, Shauna, if you could.
Okay, thanks, Carol. First, a big thanks to Laurie for organizing, bringing us all together, and for Carol for agreeing to be our moderator. So our question tonight is Canada a safe haven? And are we doing too much or too little resettlement of refugees? And so to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to start by clarifying who is a refugee and the different ways, including resettlement, that refugees find safety in Canada. So the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees defines a refugee in Article 1. And Article 1 states, an individual who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his oceans. We have the Arctic to our north, and we have the United States to our south. And I'm happy to talk about the United States and circumstances there in the Q&A. But the reality is that many refugees have no possible way of getting to Canada on their own. There aren't actually that many planes that fly here. You cannot get on a rickety raft and cross the ocean. And you'd have to walk a very long way to reach our borders. And this is where resettlement comes in. Resettlement brings refugees from a second country where they have sought protection to a third country that is willing to offer them that protection. It's considered one of 3 durable solutions alongside voluntary repatriation, so returning to your home country, or local integration when you can find safety in that second country you go to. Resettlement is voluntary, which means that neither international or domestic law obligates any state to resettle refugees. This is a choice Canada makes and has historically made as a contribution to responsibility sharing for the protection of refugees. Now, to give you some context, and this is where the numbers come in. Globally, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, reports that there are 19.9 million refugees under its mandate, and this does not even include more than 5 million Palestinian refugees under a separate mandate. These are refugees that do not yet have the durable, secure protection of a state. 85% of the world's refugees are in the developing world, with Iran, Lebanon, Pakistan, Uganda, and Turkey all hosting 1 million or more refugees. Of these numbers, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees identifies those refugees most in need of resettlement. And in 2018, they've identified 1.2 million refugees most in need of resettlement that they refer for resettlement. And we don't have the 2018 numbers yet, but in 2017, UNHCR was provided with only 75,000 spots for resettlement of refugees. And this was a 54% drop from the 2016 numbers. And yes, that 54% drop is a result of a lessening of resettlement in the United States. The United States numbers actually dropped to 75% between 2017 and 2016, but other countries covered some of that basis. So yes, Canada is a safe haven to some refugees. But of the 286,479 new permanent residents to Canada in 2017, only 27,000 of those came as resettlement refugees. That's about 10% through all three resettlement channels, being the government resettlement program, the private sponsorship program, and the blended visa officer program. In comparison, in 2017, Canada welcomed 159,000 permanent resident admissions through our economic class. So people we are welcoming into Canada as new immigrants because of their economic value to our country. Nor does Canada's resettlement all come from the United Nations referrals. Canada permits resettlement through its private sponsorship program that casts the net more broadly than the UN refugee definition. So that broader net includes individuals who are or have been seriously and personally affected by civil war, armed conflict, mass violation of human rights in their home country. And not that those people aren't in need of protection as well, but what that means is that of the over 1 million refugees identified by the UN in need of resettlement, out of the 19.9 million refugees under the UN mandate, in 2017, Canada resettled under 9,000 of those refugees. And this is because 62% of our current resettlement does come from the private sponsorship program. So my final questions as I wrap up here are, what are you going to do if you're one of the vast majority of the world's refugees who does not get resettled to Canada or another of the few states offering resettlement protection? Over 13.4 million of the refugees under the UN mandate, 2/3 of the global total, are in protracted refugee situations. And what that means is a situation where 25,000 or more refugees of a particular nationality have been in a state of exile without a durable solution for 5 years or more, and often many, many more years than 5. So if you are desperate enough and able enough, you will seek protection on your own and try to cross into a country like Canada. And this does trigger Canada's legal obligations. When you cross that border and come here on your own, that does trigger our obligations to see if you meet the refugee definition, and if you meet the refugee definition, not to send you away. And my final point to start us off here is that individuals claiming asylum in Canada don't steal spaces or queue jump in front of the resettlement refugees. These are separate programs that are not in any way connected. You might say it's comparing apples to oranges. And so a rise in asylum numbers on our border does not push or limit the refugees that Canada would accept through resettlement. So that's where I'll leave it now.
Thanks, Shauna. Abdi?
Thank you. Well, Shauna has told us about our global humanitarian commitment, our place in the global protection of refugees, our history in taking the lead whenever conflict hotspots displace vulnerable populations, and the limits of our humanitarian action in the global refugee protection regime. But as a follow-up to Shauna's discussion, I'll start with a few statements. While we Canadians may rightly pride ourselves on our history stepping up, it is important to remember that we are a settler nation that originally displaced indigenous people, and that our history has subsequently included more than a few darker spots and chapters. That in its protection or in its refugee protection system, Canada has often selected the cream of the crop. That deeply ingrained racial and political prejudice have also informed the government's choices about who to admit in the past and who to turn away. For instance, Canada infamously allowed only a few thousand displaced Jews into the country at the height of the Nazi terror in Europe, with a government official quoted as saying that when it came to Jewish refugees, none is too many. And the returning of Sikh refugees, many to their deaths in the Komagata Maru incident in 1914. That we are always slow to act when unique displacement of people calls us to action. For instance, to the plight of Chilean refugees in the 70s, with the Syrian refugees, with our own Prime Minister hoarding the files of Syrian files for processing in his own office, just to prevent them from being processed. And with current issues like the Rohingya refugees, and the many refugees who have been displaced with the conflict from our own arms that we sell to the Saudi government. That to date, we haven't engaged in large-scale resettlement of African refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, while Somali refugees languish in protracted situations in East Africa for nearly 30 years with no durable solution in sight, and with the Sudanese and Congolese still languishing in refugee camps. However, when our government has been slow to action, Canadians themselves have often stepped up and instead insisted on helping. The recent Syrian refugee crisis and the arrival of 60,000 Vietnamese-born people in the 1970s are good examples of how a groundswell of popular support can make welcoming thousands of people in a short period possible. But on to when we resettle refugees. As we got from Shauna's presentation, Canada is a safe haven to some refugees. When we resettle some refugees in this country, we provide some supports. We provide them with employment supports. We provide them with some language instruction programs. We give them orientation, and we show them how to live in Canada to a limited scale. However, while we do all this, we haven't really prepared ourselves and adjust our systems to welcome refugees to our country. We haven't adjusted our systems to accommodate the refugees and their needs. Rather, we expect that the refugees themselves adjust themselves to our system. I'll say a few things about a few challenges. Mental health. Many of the refugees that we bring into this country have been through conflict and war situations. Many of them have seen family members killed and decapitated in front of their own eyes and have lost light family members. When they get here, they need enormous support so that the mental health situations does not force them into situations of despair. However, as our provinces and our federal government fight each other on whose responsibility it is to cater for the mental health needs of refugees who struggle with mental health issues really suffer. Our government brings refugees, it does not invest in mental health. The provinces are not supporting because the government of Canada brought these refugees, therefore they should be able to take care of them. Financial situations. We make refugees pay transportation loans. Before we bring these refugees to this country, we make them sign an agreement saying that the flight cost to come to Canada, when they get to Canada, they must start paying. It tells us that we are telling refugees to start from a position of negative financial situation. Many of them come in with a cost as much as $10,000 on their head, and they have to pay 1 month after arrival. Employment. While we have very able, skilled refugees, some of them with very high, lofty academic credentials, we do not provide them with the opportunity to be able to participate in our economic system. Our regulation systems are very archaic. Some things that we have used in the 1960s are what we still use. We haven't brought ourselves to modern immigration to be able to include these people in our economy. Therefore, we waste their brains doing free jobs. Experiences of children and youth. While many of our refugee youth go to our schools, participate in the learning system, our schools are not prepared to support these kids. The schools, the way we train our teachers, we do not provide the necessary skills to teach these kids. The teachers who go through our universities are prepared to teach ordinary kids who are grown up here. They are not prepared to teach the refugee kids who have gone through war. These kids are going through war every day. The kids from Syria, their families are going through war every day, and they get reports of family members who are killed yesterday. If that happened to refugee kids who are born here, will provide grief counseling and all these kind of things. Kids go through grief every day, yet we carry on as though things have normal. Nothing has happened to these kids. Housing. When we adjust ourselves to bring in many refugees with many children, our housing situation caters only to traditionally small Canadian families of 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. Many of these refugee kids are cramped up in small apartments where kids are not able to adjust themselves, not able to learn, work at night, and it's quite problematic for the families. Even in our justice system, quite adversarial for many families who have been used to the restorative justice practices, where if something happens, it's resolved through where everybody gains from the justice system. But here it's quite problematic, and the needs, the skills that people bring and the experience that people bring is not accommodated in our system. And lastly, the family reunification. Many refugees have left their family members. It takes awfully long time for government to reunite mothers with their children, husbands with their wives, wives with their husbands, to get here, to get together. In this time, families are breaking apart and children are, growing up without their parents. But while we do this, refugees are an awesome people. They are quite resilient. They go through all these challenges, but they make it through. I speak of the story of Durmar, who came with 5 kids, all under the age of 10. 1 kid with disability on all the limbs. 3 years later, she can speak English, she has her own car, and she is quite comfortable, single mother. I speak of the story of Noor Ali, the Syrian refugee who came with nothing. 5 years later, has 2 companies, employs 22 people. These are stories that make refugees when they get here, despite the challenges, despite the fact that we haven't prepared ourselves, despite the fact that our systems do not accommodate refugees, they make it and they make Canada better. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdi.
What my colleagues have said. But first to give you kind of a little bit more numbers in terms of refugees. So as Shauna had mentioned, in 2017, the UNHCR recorded over 68 million people of concern. That's a tragedy in and of itself, but 25.4 million people are refugees. That's a record number. And as Shauna had said, countries like Canada don't provide the safe haven, at least at the same rate as other countries do. So a country like Uganda, which isn't very healthy at this point, currently hosts 1.4 million refugees. Nearly 20% of Lebanon's population is a refugee. Jordan, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Ethiopia, all of them host almost 1 million refugees each. And many of these countries are refugee-sending countries as it is. So if you're a refugee, you're most likely to be in a country next door to your home country. Very unlikely to get to a high-income country like Canada. In fact, only about 1% of all the refugees who need resettling actually get to a country like Canada. In terms of Canada, in an average year, we're pretty stingy about the number of refugees we admit. In an average year over the last 20 years, we admit between 7,000 and 25,000 refugees per year, so that's pretty stingy. But we live in interesting times, maybe slightly above average times. So from November 2015 until August 2018, Canada admitted 111,460 refugees. That's on the high end of average. But it's not extraordinary. So Abdi mentioned about the 60,000 Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees that came in a one-year period in 1979 to 1980, which eclipses the 46,000 Syrians that came in 14 months in 2015-2016. But even these two events are not unusual. If we look back to 1956, when our population was just under 22 million people, we brought in 37,000 Hungarians to Canada and resettled them successfully. So proportionately, that was a much bigger number. And the Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian was much bigger. But we've done large movements of people maybe a bit more quietly in the recent past. 4,000 Karen refugees from Thailand came in 2006, and in a 4-year period between 2009 and 2013, we resettled 25,000 Iraqi refugees, and this is the first time that Canada actually looked for refugees who actually needed significant health help. So, as Shauna had mentioned earlier, we'd been cherry-picking refugees, the good ones that we thought that would settle well, and so now we're finally stepping up to doing something humanitarian-wise. I often get asked lots of interesting questions about refugees. How much do they cost? How long does it take them to get a job? So I'd like to spend the last couple of minutes of my talk this evening to kind of give you some information about refugees in this regard. So I often hear that refugees are a threat to Canadians and their jobs, that they're going to push Canadians out of their work. I also hear that refugees have higher rates of unemployment than other refugees. But research shows that over half of all refugees actually have some employment income in their first year in Canada. That's not too shabby, considering that less than 3 in 10 refugees can speak English or French at their arrival. If we look at their employment outcomes over a slightly longer period, 3 to 5 years after arrival, their employment rates actually start to match those of the people born in Canada. So 5 years after arrival, approximately 60% of refugees are employed. And you might be thinking to yourself, what's the equivalent rate for people born in Canada? That's 62%. So they're working at rates that are very similar to people who are born in Canada. Are they pushing Canadians out of jobs? In actuality, they're not. Well, they do. They push Canadians out of low-income jobs, but those low-income jobbed Canadians actually get pushed into higher-income jobs. So unfortunately for refugees, they tend to be working at low-income jobs for quite a while, but they're not taking jobs away from Canadians, they're actually increasing their income. And if we look at some of the data, this happens not only in Canada, but in the United States and in all of the European Union countries. I can give you an example. 3% of low-income people in Canada are pushed into higher-income jobs when the numbers of refugees increase. And that's a number that is replicated in the United States and in Denmark. If we look at the economy, like how much does it cost to settle a refugee? On average, it costs $21,000 per refugee in the first year for resettlement. So you might be thinking to yourself, how much does this cost Canadians? Well, if we look at the impact of refugees arriving to our economy, it's actually quite interesting. In Canada, I'm just going to flip to my, in Canada, over a lifetime, refugees pay more in taxes than they ever take out in social services over a lifetime. And this is a finding that's replicated in the United States and across Europe. Their lifetime employment rates are 10 to 12% higher than Canadians, and actually because refugees come when they're so young, the average refugee is under the age of 30 when they arrive to Canada. That means they have decades of labor market histories before they pass on. And so if you look at the amount of taxes that they actually pay more in taxes than they ever take out in terms of health or language services. In terms of use of social assistance, yes, the numbers in the first couple of years are high, but by year 5, the percentage of refugees who are taking social assistance payments are the same as people who are born in Canada. And in terms of the larger labor market investment, the figures are also interesting. In their first year of arrival, and this was in 2017 when we still had a large number of refugees coming to Canada, Canada's GDP grew at a rate of 1.85% that year. And the prediction is if we continue to bring in refugees at the meager number of 17,000 per year, that GDP growth will continue into 2040. This is a pattern that we see elsewhere, so it's not just a Canadian thing. A study in Cleveland, for instance, was very interesting. The city of Cleveland in Ohio is declining. They got hit hard with the recession and the decline of the automotive industry. So they decided, like, how are they going to get people to move to Cleveland and reinvigorate Cleveland? So in 2012, the city invested $4.8 million into bringing refugees into Cleveland. It resulted in a nearly $49 million economic benefit in a single year to that city. And if you talk to people in Cleveland now, the arrival of refugees has really influenced positively the growth of that city. So if you're thinking about refugees costing money, how much they might cost the economy in the long term, that's one really good example. If we want to look at Europe for a moment, for each euro that's invested in resettling a refugee in Europe, the economic return is 2.5 euro to the countries who resettle refugees, and that was in 2017 when the arrival of the refugees was quite high. And in Germany, which is the country that received the most refugees during that time, the GDP increased by just under 0.01%, but the next year it increased by 0.1%, and then 0.13% in 2017. They predict that by 2020, the GDP of Germany will increase by 0.84%, just because they have hosted refugees. So, in addition to the humanitarian needs that we fulfill, we often don't recognize that they bring us strong economic outcomes as well. And sometimes the humanitarian argument doesn't work very well with some people, and sometimes the economic argument does. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Okay, so now we're going to open up to questions, but in the meantime, help yourself to snacks. I've got the mic, and we want to hear everybody's questions or comments, so I'm going to roam around. Feel free to ask questions to the entire panel. Who wants to start with a question? I'd be happy to pass the mic. Anyone? Okay.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk to hear you all. What happens when people come here and they get themselves established and they want to bring their other family members in? What happens? What do they have to go through to get that done?
Well, I just brought my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law's husband last weekend.
Congratulations.
They're here. Now we have to move to the struggles of having them to, not only catch up with Canadians, but be ahead of Canadians. It ranges from who you are trying to bring. If you're bringing your family members, for example, if you left, for example, my brother-in-law that I just sponsored left his wife, my sister-in-law, who is in Somalia. So he has 1 year window, what's called 1 year window of opportunity, where he can sponsor her and the 2 kids. And this way, then the processing starts within 1 year, and he can be reunited. Even though the processing, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, by the way. And this is what I talk about when I talk about anecdotes of racism in our operation system, in that it takes 6 months to process such a case in Rome, in France, but it takes about 4 years to process in Nairobi and Pretoria and Accra. So it's problematic. So that's what they can do. If immediate family members, there are sponsorship programs that are available, so long as the family member is under the age of 19 and you can prove economic dependency. If you have extended family members, then there are private sponsorship opportunities that you can go through what is called sponsorship agreement holders. For example, hospitality house. Manitoba Interfaith Immigration Council, and some other religious, faith-based institutions that do sponsorships. But over the last couple of years, the private sponsorship program has shrunk tremendously, to use that Trump word. It has shrunk very much. It was an open system where people could sponsor as many people as they could. But the problem is the government does not want to invest in resourcing the visa posts in the refugee-producing areas. For example, the Nairobi visa post processes refugees from 18 countries. Half of those countries are engulfed in conflict and are refugee-producing countries. How do you expect 2 visa officers to process refugees from those places? So it takes a long time for those kind of things. There are groups of 5 sponsorships. For example, if I'm one person, I don't get the sponsorships, I can appeal to Laurie, Shauna, and some of my friends to come together and we pool resources together to sponsor a refugee. So those are a couple of things that we can use.
Can I just add one thing to that, Carol? Sorry.
Sure.
Everything that Abdi said is accurate, except for there's this really cruel provision in our IRPA regulations called 117.9D. And what that means is if the person, when they're reviewed by the Canadian government for their immigration to Canada as a resettled refugee, if they haven't disclosed a family member, they haven't mentioned a child, for various reasons to keep that child protected of their own security, or because they think that child is dead or that partner is dead. If you do not disclose a living family member when you're making your application to come to Canada, you are barred from bringing that person, even regardless of the 1-year window.
Yeah.
And it is one of the harshest provisions of the law, because even if in other circumstances of fraud or misrepresentation, and you are barred from coming to Canada, that's just a 10-year ban and then you can reapply. The 117.9D is a permanent thing, with the exception of rare humanitarian and compassionate discretion to override it, but it's one of the cruelest provisions in our law.
That's happening right now. I'm working on a story about the Yazidis who've resettled here. And a lot of them had thought or were told that relatives had died, and so they're trying to apply under the 1-year window provision, and they're being told, no, you didn't mention this person in your original application, so, you know, there's no way you're ever going to be able to bring them in now. And they're saying, but we thought, we were told they were dead, and they're not. And it's really, really tragic. But, you know, to ward against fraud, the government says that if you didn't mention them in the first place, you know, they're dead to us, in all, you know, for all purposes, so.
It's not mentioning the prejudice, like, is mentioning them prejudice their application? Does this just evolve to that?
Well, in some circumstances, it might. So a single mother with 3 children who gets resettled because she's a single mother with 3 children might not have been selected as that rare 1% of refugees who get selected for resettlement if it turned out that she did have a partner. So there are sort of real legitimate reasons where the government says we have to know who you are and what's included in your application. But I think the reality is there's many more circumstances where it's not an intentional mechanism to trick the government, and there are separate fraud and misrepresentation consequences for all immigrants that could simply override this.
I'm Karen Gordon from Hospitality House Refugee Ministry, and I'm currently living with 6 refugees in our house, and we sponsored many more. In 2000, we used to be able to sponsor as many people as we thought we could support. We often did this in partnership with family members who were here. So this was a form of family reunification, and it worked very well. The government, however, restricted the number of people that they would process. Now, Abdi spoke about that. In any 1 year, that they would bring to Canada any 1 year. So they wound up having a huge backlog overseas. And at the end of 2011, they imposed a moratorium and with strict limits on the number of people who can be sponsored. So this year, the private sponsors across Canada, and between various church congregations, etc., various groups, there have to be more than 1,000 people who are interested, 1,000 groups that are interested in doing refugee sponsorship. We're all competing for permission to bring a total of 8,500 refugees to Canada under the private sponsorship program, which is, so we're all competing for those spaces. And it's quite tragic. One of the things that I think I should raise is the fact that in 1992, the Government of Canada terminated the assisted relative program. My father was one of the few people in our city in Thunder Bay who spoke Hungarian. So when I was 10 years old, I was going to the train station with my dad, and he was tasked with settling all of the Hungarians. This was very informal. There was no welcome place. There was no, system to take care of these people. A member of Parliament locally was a good friend of my father's. He would just phone him from Ottawa and say, "John, you pick these people up at the train station and you take care of them." And he did. And my parents were immigrants here, and all of a sudden, and they were only children, but all of a sudden I had all of these adopted Hungarian aunties and uncles. And that's what sort of piqued my interest in this. And my own grandfather was a refugee. He was ethnic German in Bratislava. At the end of the Second World War, he was thrown out of Bratislava, he was thrown out of Czechoslovakia. They confiscated all of his belongings, and he was a wealthy man, but all of a sudden he had nothing. My father impressed on me, he said, "You should be glad that I chose Canada, because this can happen to anybody." I just remember, I have strong memories of all of those people with their suitcases and papers and absolutely no language, and they all settled well within 5 years. My father sold real estate. He spoke 8 languages, and he sold real estate to newcomers. And many of the newcomers came here under the assisted relative program, which is being cancelled by the government, which is something that we should really be pressing the federal government to renew, restore.
Okay, questions?
I just have a question about terminology. Is there a difference in meaning between an asylum seeker and a refugee? And is it a meaningful difference?
Good question, I think.
So it's an interesting thing because someone seeks asylum, and so the idea is you're seeking asylum, seeking protection. And throughout most of the world, there's the general sort of conversation about asylum seekers. And historically in Canada, we have simply called asylum seekers refugee claimants. And so the distinction there is if someone's a refugee, they're a refugee. You don't become a refugee when the Immigration and Refugee Board recognizes you as a refugee. You're either a refugee or not, but you have to show that you meet that definition. So someone comes to the border seeking asylum, and they say, "I am a refugee," and then they go through that process to see if the Canadian system, through the Immigration and Refugee Board, recognizes them as meeting that definition. So do they have a well-founded fear of persecution for reason of race, religion, nationality, and are outside their country of origin and unable or unwilling to return? So there's no difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee claimant. A refugee is someone who has been recognized as a refugee. The reality in Canada, though, is the moment you're recognized as a refugee, you get permanent residence. So the moment you're recognized as a refugee, you don't actually need to be a refugee. And resettlement refugees get that permanent resident visa even before they come to Canada, because that sort of process of seeing if they meet our definitions is happening overseas instead of happening in country. But the moment you're actually recognized as a refugee in a country like Canada, you're a permanent resident. What the United Nations does is the United Nations has their own mandate status. So I used to work for UNHCR in India, and India isn't actually a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So what do you do with refugees in a place that doesn't recognize refugees? Well, India lets the United Nations set down a house there, and not a house, an office, but recognize certain populations as refugees in India under the UN's mandate. So they're not being recognized by the government of India, they're being recognized by the United Nations under their mandate to also meet that definition in the same way that a state would. So there's sort of different terminology that works in that way depending on where you are.
So would it be fair to say that an asylum seeker is somebody who's waiting to have their refugee status confirmed? Is that fair to say?
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Good job, Carol.
I've asked that question many times too, so any other questions, comments?
Thank you. I'm wondering whether there's any research done or going on into what accounts for the variations in the public attitude toward refugees or immigrants, because it seems in Canada, for instance, that it has highs and lows over, sometimes just over a few months, but certainly over the years. And has anybody studied what accounts for that?
I'll give it a shot. So there's lots of polling firms that repeatedly ask the questions, do you support refugees? Do you think they're too many, too few, just the right number of refugees coming to Canada? And you're right, the public opinion goes up and down, up and down. It depends a lot on what's going on. So in Syria, when the crisis heightened, the public opinion in favor of refugees, particularly in Canada, increased. And so you saw the Liberal government in 2015, I'll be blunt, capitalizing on particularly the death of Alan Kurdi, the little 3-year-old boy whose body washed up on the shore. They really capitalized on the fact that Canadians were very empathetic. And so you saw support for refugees going up. But then if our politicians and our leaders start to talk poorly about refugees and they start to use inflammatory language or misinformation, then public opinion will go down as well. So I think our politicians have a lot to do with the public opinion, but also how we feel about people who are different than us. So I think about when we flew in the 5,000 Kosovar refugees in 1999. We flew in 5,000 of them from Kosovo in 6 weeks. And a lot of people were surprised when they arrived to find out that they were Muslim. So at the start of that, people were like, yes, we have to save the Kosovars. But then when they came and they found out that they weren't Christian and that they weren't willing to convert out of gratitude, public opinion started to go down. And the way that we've had to deal with those kinds of things has changed too. And so you can't subtract the stereotypes and the racism and the suspicion that we might have about religions who are different than Christianity. I can let you guys go at it too.
I'm not a researcher, so I don't have a lot of things. My life is just based on what I see and what I interact with. But I was at a conference in Montreal last week, and they talked about something called issue entrepreneurship. And when politicians engage in issue entrepreneurship of immigration, when they become real entrepreneurs like Michel Repple and Maxime Bernier, when we have those kind of folks, and Donald Trump, when we have those kind of folks, or Kelly Lynch, when we have those kind of folks suffocating our airwaves, it really, really emboldens even the person who harbored some kind of a prejudice towards refugees. It emboldens, it offers them an opportunity, a platform to be able to do this kind of, to reject the refugees. So, and that multiplies, has a ripple effect on people, neighbors and all these kind of things. So that's why you see sometimes up when, politicians are saying these kind of things, sometimes down when Stephen Herbert collects all the Syrian files and political staffers collect all the Syrian files and puts them in the PMO and prevent the public service from processing those forms to process Syrian refugees. Canadians get angry and become supportive to the refugees, those kind of things.
And I would just say, I think we're coming on an election, and one of the things, I'm on the advocacy committee of the Canadian Association for Refugee Lawyers, and we're really concerned about the sort of political football that will be played again with refugees. But one of the really interesting things over the last few years is you did see this massive, massive support for the Syrian resettlement and a real community engagement. But operating alongside of that was still this constant comments on the illegals crossing the border. And the fight of refugee lawyers to explain that that is not an illegal crossing and that they have the right to claim asylum and that there is nothing illegal or wrong or violating of that, and that a refugee who actually comes and claims asylum is in fact triggering our legal rights, whereas again resettlement is this secondary voluntary thing we do. Even within that moment of support, that support was very sided on one perspective of refugees without recognizing that whether someone is recognized as a refugee in Syria or in Lebanon or in Emerson, it doesn't matter. If a refugee is a refugee if they meet the definition. And that sort of confusing manipulation that you see play out in the media sometimes has been a real sort of battle to align just base understanding in the public, which is sort of why events like this are so important.
It's hard to explain to an editor why it's not an illegal crossing. Well, if I, go to Grand Forks and I do some shopping and I try to sneak back in through the old port of entry, that's illegal. Well, it is, but it's not if you're, somebody who's seeking asylum. And yeah, it's a difficult conversation.
I'll tell the editor that's nonsense, because if you go to Grand Forks, cross the border, you're not making a refugee claim. You're not going through that border with the intent of making a refugee claim to seek protection in that country. You're engaging in adventure by going through the border. So this is completely different.
A couple of weeks ago there was an announcement about having more refugees come in the next couple of years. And I just was trying to find that. Are you aware? I'm just not sure what it was. I thought that there was going to be, they were going to allow more refugees in the next 2 years, but I'm wondering, I just was curious about it because I haven't read anything more about it from when I sort of heard it in passing on the news.
The government puts out an annual report, and they sort of have a sort of projection of their refugee numbers. And so right now, through the annual report, we know the government projections till 2021, in fact. And in those numbers, in terms of resettlement, one of the interesting things is absolutely private sponsors are getting more and more constraints and limitations on how they can sponsor, but the government is at the same time putting more and more and more of resettlement responsibility on private sponsors. So moving forward to 2020, 2021, government-assisted resettlement is going to be projected about 10,000, which is in fact more than it was previously, but government resettlement used to double private sponsorship. So government resettlement used to be about 7,500, private sponsorship used to be about 3,500. Moving into 2020, 2021, the government is planning for 20,000 privately sponsored. So then that's a gain on Canadians. So it's a real sort of privatization of the responsibility, which on one side, in terms of the support, in terms of the integration, in terms of the willingness of Canadians to befriend and know refugees and work with them and have them part of their community, private sponsorship is amazing. But in terms of the government meeting its own international obligations, it's quite disappointing.
We hear a lot about what's happening in the States with Trump, and there's 20,000 migrants coming up from South America, and he's blocking the border to them. From what I'm hearing, it's almost illegal that somebody, like a government, can stop refugees coming into a country for safe haven.
Do you want me to talk on this? This is me. Okay. I told them I would read up on Trump because trying to figure out American law sometimes is very complicated, but it's actually not American law you have to figure out, it's just what Trump is doing, which isn't really law. So, the United States has not actually signed the Refugee Convention. What they've signed is the 1967 Protocol, which just sort of gets rid of the geographic and temporal limits of the 1951 Convention. So, the United States is currently still committed in international law to the refugee definition and the principle of non-refoulement, as is Canada. And so the United States has a commitment in international law that's brought into their domestic law, their Refugee Act, the 1980 Refugee Act, that they are committed to granting asylum. So the same rules apply. If a refugee gets to the border and says, I am a refugee, the United States is obligated to process that person as a refugee. what is happening currently is that they are trying to limit access to the border. So they are limiting access to the border so that people cannot actually present. And most recently, they've been limiting access by using tear gas, and arguing that is self-defense from some rocks being thrown. But they're limiting access that way. They tried to limit, by limiting access, they were encouraging people to cross irregularly, in which case then that's when they were doing the separation of children. So if people entered irregularly, they would separate the children. So these are mechanisms to dissuade people from crossing. Now the interesting thing is that Mexico is also a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So these individuals are coming mostly from Honduras and also from El Salvador, and they've been coming up. Some of them have walked over 4,000 kilometers at this point. And they're coming with their children, and they're sick, and they're tired, and they're coming. And so the question is, well, why can't they stay in Mexico, and why does the US have to even think about them if they're in Mexico? And so what that's about is safe third country agreements. And Canada and the United States actually have a safe third country agreement. And so what Canada and the United States have said is we recognize each other as safe countries for refugees. So even though if a refugee presents on my border as Canada as a refugee, I'm obligated to them because I have this agreement with the United States, it's okay for that person to claim protection in the United States. And the way Canada's agreement with the United States works is it's only if it happens at a port of entry. So if you present at a port of entry, aside from a few exceptions, Canada can say, sorry, we don't have to process you as a refugee here because you can do so in the United States. Now the consequence of that is, of course, that people are entering irregularly because they don't want to be processed in the United States, because the United States does not and has not actually processed them very fairly. And there is actually a challenge to whether the United States is a safe country for Canada to have this agreement going through the courts right now in Canada to challenge that agreement. In the case in Mexico, it would be, and President Trump has indeed been trying to get a safe third country agreement with Mexico, and the United Nations recognizes the potential for countries to have safe third country agreements. The European Union has the Dublin Agreement, which essentially does the same thing. You have to be processed in the first country you arrive in. Mexico itself has major security concerns, human rights violations. They, I believe, are deporting about 100 asylum seekers a day from their...
It's actually up to 450.
It's up to 450 a day. And many, many Mexicans actually claim refugee protection in the United States. And Canada. And so the difficulty in ever securing a safe third country agreement with the United States is near impossible, even if they were willing to do it. The other thing that is happening now is the United States is trying to sort of create a waiting room policy where individuals will still be processed for protection in the US, which might take years. But while they're there, they'd have to wait in Mexico for that processing.
They're processing 12 people a day.
Well, they're letting 12 people a day go through that sort of, that's just starting a process that's not giving them safety. Yeah.
And there's 3,000 people sitting at the Tijuana border crossing right now. So that's going to take them quite a while to process that. But the caravan, people move in caravans for safety because it's not safe to travel by yourself. You get robbed, you get raped and beaten up and sometimes murdered. And the caravans, they're not new. These have been going on for 10 years. There's about 3 a year. But what you don't hear is that most of the people never make it to the US border. They actually end up stopping, either living in Mexico, and Mexico happily gives them jobs. What you may not know, there's businesses even in Winnipeg who are recruiting people to work in factories in Mexico. And we're not talking about 2 or 3 people. We're talking about one company is 625 jobs they want to offer. And so most of the people aren't even going to make it to the United States because all they want is a safe place to live and a job. And that's why they're coming. So it's a bit of it's fear where there doesn't need to be fear, and a lot of misinformation about what the movement is all about.
Have they found have they put the children and the parents together?
There's 500 that are not put together.
Yeah.
And they think, the Americans believe, at least the last I read, they won't be able to put them together because the kids are so young and the parents have disappeared, or they don't know where the parents are, and the parents don't know where the kids are. So how do you put them together?
I think the question that we should ask ourselves, just as a question, is the United States actually a safe third country for refugees?
I wanted to ask a question of the woman from the University Law School. And this is, I was just going to ask you on my own, but people might be interested. I'm curious about, you're an associate professor. Do you teach, I was curious what your course was and who you teach it to. And do you, just for my own information, but I thought other people might be interested as well.
So I'm an assistant professor, but I only the academics would care about that.
Takes a while.
I teach right now. I teach 4 courses, so 2 per term. So this term I'm teaching immigration and citizenship law and international law. And next term I'm teaching human rights and refugee law. And increasingly, we have a really dedicated group of law students. So all my students in those courses are 2nd or 3rd year law students. And 2.5 years ago, when the border crossings started increasing, 2 of my fabulous students, one of whom I had just nominated for CBC's Future 40 and she won it, 2 of my fabulous students actually came to me and said, we want to do something, can we help in any way? And so I called Rita at Welcome Place and I said, I have law students desperate to help you. And so for the past 2 years now, we've had a group of 20 law student volunteers, each being at Welcome Place, 2 students a day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, every day of the week, helping with the paralegals there to process refugee claimants who come in for their basis of claims. And the amazing thing about that is that the more students who do that, some of them haven't even taken my classes yet, and then they take my classes and they've met refugees and they know the histories and they know the stories, and it's been a really wonderful experience. And many of the students come from the global college, and so they've already been working at IRCOM or doing experiences even before they get to law school, and some of the students came as refugees themselves, and so there's a real sort of power and movement. And I've been at U of M for 5 years now, and I feel that there's so much energy in the students doing advocacy work for refugees right now.
Thank you. Do you ever go and speak at high schools or junior highs? I'm an early childhood person, and I really believe the younger you start for anything really has the most effect. And that's where I was just curious,
Right.
whether you ever speak at any of the schools?
Absolutely. So, I'm going to Balmoral Hall next week, but that's just because I'm an alum. But I've spoken at Hugh John Macdonald, I've spoken at Miles MacDonnell, and one of the things I do sometimes with Abdi and some others is a really great program called Bread and Borders, which is a myth-busting program, and the entire toolkit is on Immigrant Partnership Winnipeg's website. Do you want to talk about Bread and Borders a bit?
Yeah, I think you can, if you wanted to look at it, you can Google, it's called Bread and Borders Toolkit. It's on our website. It's a great resource for myth-busting, for training people, to help these different sorts of conversations. There's conversation with neighbors, conversation with friends, conversation with all friends in terms of describing refugees and who refugees are. It talks about refugee claimants. There's activities for groups, activities for big groups, small groups. There's also questionnaires that you can use to, myth-bust as well. They are resources that you can refer to if people had questions for you that you can use to answer questions, I think.
Questions?
And we get invited to things. So me and Shauna, for example, last time we trained federal government staff here and in Regina on the toolkit, so that they can actually, when they receive refugees, they can actually make humane support to humane processing of refugees without having to come with the hard, they're illegal, that kind of stuff.
So we did it for the Department of Health. I also went and did it in Morden with Diversitas. So there's been lots of different,
I don't have a question, but I just have a brief comment, and that is that Nancy and I are friends, and we are part of a private sponsorship circle
initiated by Nancy 2.5 years ago. And our family was a family of 8 from Syria, from Idlib, through Lebanon, through a camp in Lebanon, which was a horrific experience. The experience of being the helpers for this family, being a part of the private sponsorship circle, and it is a circle of us that help that meet the needs of this family, has been, I think Nancy would probably agree with me, probably one of the most wonderful experiences of our lives. It's pretty much every week, almost every day, that there are issues and needs that need to be dealt with, because there are 6 children. So all of the coordination with the schools, with doctors, dentistry, with the government, with housing issues, with just a gazillion issues. There's just so much. And I see myself as a grandmother, but my children and my grandchildren live outside of Manitoba, so I have lots of time. I'm retired. They are my surrogate grandchildren in a way of the family. And what happens when you have this relationship with a family that you choose to have, you bond with them in a very special way. And I believe it's a bond for life, really. So it's been a great experience. I think that we who have had private sponsorship experiences need to talk about our experiences, and we do. We probably talk about them amongst our friends to the point that they don't want to maybe hear anymore, because it's like they get weekly reports from us. But a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience. And the other thing is that I believe that we learn something about our country in teaching another family who literally comes to our doors not knowing anything about our country, how to speak English, anything. We learn about our country ourselves because we have to teach them so much. So a quick little thing that I taught one of the boys on his way to his hockey a couple of weeks ago. He thought the police were following us. He thought he could hear a siren, and I said, no, there's no siren. And if the police were following us, in our country, they are our friends. They are here to help look after us, to protect us, to help us understand the rule of law. And that is a good thing, because in their country it's a little scary. Somebody comes after you with a uniform and they're part of the military, and that's to be frightened of. So there's so much that we learn about our own country and about the living circumstances of people in other countries and what they're coming from. I'll just private sponsorship and how it makes the citizenship of the Canadians doing the private sponsorship. And I've been spending this fall interviewing the sponsors of Syrian refugees. And I promised my lead researcher at the University of Toronto that I would seek out further Winnipeg private sponsors willing to talk to me about their experience resettling Syrian refugees. So if there's any more of you in the room here who want to do an hour-long interview with me on your experience resettling Syrian refugees, please contact me after this.
You've got a few candidates.
Then in our group, I'm sure we'll do it.
Hi there. I have a lot of respect for private sponsorship groups, primarily because I'm part of them. And there's an awful lot of it also going on in rural Manitoba that I would love to talk to you about. And so saying that, one of the things that concerns me is I need more training and more follow-up to adopt a puppy or a kitty than to support a refugee family. It's true.
Yes.
It's true. I cannot adopt a puppy or kitty from a shelter. But if 5 of us care, and we're good people, and we're trying our best, but if 5 of us care, yes, you can have a family with hardly any follow-up. And the other thing that's happened lots with the BVOR program, the Blended Visa program, there was a lot of really good stuff going on a couple of years ago, and now there's a lot of burnout and frustration. And so, especially if more focus is going to be on the private sponsorship groups, is there anything that can be done, or any research shows that we could prepare people better, or things that could be done to get around systems so we can communicate better? Yeah, just that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Don. I can take that one because I'm entering the field in a study of the sponsors of the private sponsorship model, and that's the very question that we're asking the private sponsors is what kind of information do they need? When do they need it? What kind of information was garbage? That sort of thing. And then we're going to talk to the refugees as well to talk to them about their partnership with their sponsors, because we don't know I mean, anecdotally, most of the sponsorships are good and the families get along, but there's some cases where the families don't get along and the relationship dies, and so why does it die? And that's precisely what we'll be looking at this January.
And I think like one of the interesting things is the Syrian moment was a really different moment, and there's a lot of people probably even in this room who did sponsorships for the first time, who'd never done a sponsorship before, but Karen can probably talk about how there's a long-standing group of sponsors who've done sponsorships over 40 years again and again and again. So they were all old pros, and the reality of a new government coming in and taking this program that operated in one way and facilitating this moment of generosity and humanitarianism, the broader Canadian public, I don't think they quite realized what they were stepping into and the lack of training that was really needed, because it was a real different rollout, and I know IRCC is very aware of that at this point.
The other thing that I'll say is any refugee that comes here or is sponsored has ethnocultural community members from their own communities in here. It's often good to connect with the communities of those refugees. A few refugees may want to move on, but most refugees will find a lot of social capital within their own communities and may be helpful to the private sponsors by even simply looking at the intricacies of, oh, what is this person doing? Oh, he's praying, or or the phone, for example, has the call to prayer. And, oh, what's that music? All those kind of things. Just simply putting things in shape. I think the communities of those refugees can provide a lot of leverage in terms of looking at some of the needs that the private sponsors have.
But what do you do if you're in a rural area and the closest ethnocultural communities in Winnipeg, and it's 200 kilometers away?
That's quite a challenge. We had a family in Killarney. Was it Killarney? Yeah. Where we had some folks who went from here all the way to there. I think Don was one of them. To actually support these families. Often when you don't have ethnocultural communities that are present in that community, it's quite a challenge to the community. But I think Manitoba is not such a large province. I think seeking out community members, for example, in 2016 we had a big event for Syrian refugees, for socializing together. We invited the federal immigration minister and all these kind of things. But you know what? We had about 15 families from rural Manitoba who came just for the sake of connecting with community members. So those kind of things, making the trip, making the extra, trip to be able to connect with members. But at the same time, I think private sponsorship groups like the sponsorship agreement holders need to establish an online kind of a thing where these materials can be available that people can use.
Speaking about the mental health issues, of the trauma that the refugees have experienced, pretty serious trauma, for the private sponsors, and because there isn't the support of the mental health system for Canadians or anyone for that matter, is there vicarious trauma to the private sponsors?
What I'll say is that anyone who is a witness to trauma actually gets traumatized, I think. If, for example, you have sponsored Syrian refugees from Aleppo, for example, and that night they report that their uncle got decapitated, or a bomb exploded in their family member. Sorry, I'm using very strong language because this is what happens to these families. It's real. So if it happens to the families and you are witnessing this, it can happen to you. So there's an awesome organization called Aurora Family Therapy that provides this kind of support. I saw John here, Edie, he was here. So that can provide that kind of support. But as you said, mental health support is a challenge to Canadians. It's even more challenging to refugees who have trauma, because the province is saying, the feds brought you, you should be able to care, the feds can only provide crisis counseling totally to 8 hours only. Nothing more, nothing less. The worst, what even makes it worse is that the mental health system is premised on Western way of, treating and, supporting, providing mental health supports. It does not include any of the traditional mechanisms or the ways of mental health is addressed by this community. So it's quite troubling in this country for refugees who have gone through all this. Actually, we're doing very well that these refugees are not collapsing under all this because they are quite resilient. They have been through worse things and can able to overcome some of these things. But when the challenges happen, we have nothing.
At the beginning, Shauna, I think it was, spoke about Palestinian refugees. Can you say, or anyone on the panel, say a little bit more about that and how that situation, I think, is a little bit different, perhaps, than other, and because they're counted differently?
They're counted differently because they're under their own mandate. So there's a separate, distinct mandate for the Palestinian refugees. And all that means is, so when I was saying under the UN's mandate there's 19.9, and then Laurie said 24 point something, and that's the distinction between the UNRWA mandate and the UNHCR mandate. Don't make
United Nations for Agency for Refugee Works, eh?
I think so.
Too many acronyms.
There's a lot of acronyms, and so. It's in the international realm, it means there's slightly different supervision of it and responsibility for it. It doesn't really shift much in terms of how resettlement works to Canada because our net is broader anyway, and the reality is people might be recognized as refugees by the UN and still not be accepted for resettlement to Canada, and there's been cases that challenge that. And so there's a real distinction there. I don't think, though, many of the Palestinian refugees pursue resettlement in any way, but I can't actually speak to that.
I think from the politics perspective, when the agency, the UN agency, UN Refugee Agency, I don't know, UNRWA, UN Refugee Works Agency for Palestinian refugees, a lot of the countries and a lot of the Palestinians at the time, a lot of the countries in the region and the Palestinians were worried about the right of return of Palestinians to their original homeland. And Palestinians are still worried about, going back to their original homeland. So some of these intricacies are quite important. For example, except Jordan, many of the other Arab countries do not provide citizenship to Palestinians because they don't want to jeopardize Palestinians' right of return. So those are political issues that we have to deal with and the international community has to deal with.
I've met some Palestinians in Winnipeg.
Quite.
Questions? No?
You talked about certain laws, unjust laws. Is there anybody challenging those laws or any kind of policies in the government?
They're challenged in terms of, there's a researcher at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, Jamie Liu, who's doing a lot of research on it and has done a couple of reports documenting all the individual cases where these problems have been happening with 117.9D. She recently, there's the Standing Committee on Immigration, and she recently testified in terms of the future of Canadian immigration, and this was one of the topics that she raised there as well, to make it more known, to make it sort of challenge to parliamentarians to think about. But there's no actual challenge. The difficulty is an individual who's encountering that law would then have their own options to pursue, and so there's a Section 25 application for humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So if there was sort of a legitimate claim there, you might pursue, which would be costly and would cost you at least $5,000 minimum and sort of have other issues. You could pursue your individual claim for an H&C application to bring that family member over regardless, but that wouldn't solve the law. It's just over discretionary overturning of your individual case.
But isn't there some smart students that are of law that can work pro bono and just basically go after those kind of things?
Well, the reports are there. The reports are there from the academics, and the academics and the law students are speaking to the government, but that would require a change in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and an amendment to the law that the government would have to pursue.
I've worked with a few excluded family class members who are the people who are excluded because of this clause, and it's quite difficult. The other day I assisted a mother who thought her daughter was dead and moved to Yemen as a refugee, married, had other children, went to Eritrea and moved from Eritrea, was resettled from Eritrea to Canada. All of a sudden, someone contacts her from Ethiopia saying that her 15-year-old daughter is actually in Ethiopia. So we have to start sponsorship again, looked at all kinds of options. I'm not a lawyer, but she's very low income, she cannot hire a lawyer. So I had to look at all the, what is it called, Baker versus what? These legal case called Baker versus Government of Canada or something like that. That I use, look at the United Nations rights of the child, our obligations to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, our, what is it called, the best interest of the child, and all these kind of things. I brought all things together in my rudimentary knowledge of what I was looking at and sent it to the Minister's office under the HNC grounds and got approved. And the process now is going through the visa office in Nairobi.
Well, who needs lawyers?
It's going to the visa office in Nairobi. I have found another woman from Ethiopia who also left her child because they were also displaced in the same kind of way. We sent the application, are waiting for for a response from the minister's office. Those anecdotal kind of things happen, but it's the law that needs to be changed, because if it happens to the family and you have a government that doesn't listen, you're screwed forever.
We have time for one more question.
Do you get any help with legal aid?
I haven't explored legal aid. I don't think if legal aid is able to assist. I haven't explored it, but having said that, my thinking was that legal aid would assist those kind of things, because legal aid assists what's here in this city, I think, in my...
Legal aid does very limited support for refugee claims, but most lawyers who are doing those claims are putting in many more hours than legal aid is actually paying them for those claims already.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, and those were really great questions and comments. It was a wonderful crowd. I'm really happy that you all came, and I hope that you check out future Café Scientifiques and fill out one of the response forms, and that's it. Thank you.